The Quarterly, the Book of Isaiah, Lesson 5, Isaiah 14. Babylon will fall. We often divide the Book of Isaiah up into two halves. Chapters 1 through 39, which have to do with judgment, and chapters 40 through 66, which have to do with salvation. And in broad strokes, that is a helpful division. But not all of the judgment in Isaiah 1 through 39 is threatened on Judah. Some of it has to do with her enemies, and is therefore good news for God's people. In particular, most of chapters 13 to 23 contain oracles against other nations, both her immediate neighbors and her longer-term enemies, such as Babylon, Assyria, and Egypt. It's not coincidental that the list starts with Babylon, the nation to which Judah would be taken into exile. Similar collections of oracles against foreign nations are found in Jeremiah, in chapters 46 to 51, and Ezekiel, chapters 25 to 32. These oracles were not intended to be preached to these foreign nations in hopes of their repentance, as was the case, for example, with Jonah's mission to Assyria. Rather, they affirmed the universality of God's justice and his ability to bring other nations to account for their pride and their atrocities against God's people, as well as affirming God's continuing concern for Abraham's offspring. If God was still enforcing the negative aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, those who dishonor you I will curse, Genesis 12:3, then there was hope that the positive promises of the covenant would also be fulfilled, even if that would take place on the far side of severe judgment for God's people. This promise was critical to maintaining hope among the few faithful followers of the Lord who listened to Isaiah's preaching during his own day, as well as for those who would return to it in subsequent generations, especially those who were themselves exiled to Babylon. As Jeremiah had promised in Jeremiah 25, 11 to 12, their sojourn there would only be temporary. The day would come when they would return to their own land, and Babylon itself would feel the terrifying impact of God's holy wrath. It's important to remember the context of this chapter. The previous chapter has already begun to lay out the coming destruction of Babylon. And here, Isaiah makes it clear that Babylon's downfall is itself a sign of hope for Israel. After the coming judgment upon Judah, the Lord will again have compassion upon his people, and he will renew their election, returning them to their own land. Isaiah 14:1. The tables will be turned on their former captors. Israel will plunder those who previously plundered them. Instead of being aliens and strangers in someone else's land, now others will be aliens and strangers in their land. Verse 2. And the result will be rest for the people, a potent image of redemption throughout the scriptures, and an end to their hard service, a phrase that describes their former bondage under the Egyptians, before God brought them out of there in the first Exodus, Exodus 1:14. These words of assurance for Israel lead into a taunt song over the soon-to-be-fallen Babylon in verses 3 to 21. The form of the song mockingly echoes the traditional lament form. It's as if the king of Babylon was being burned in effigy, praising him with a mock lament, as if everyone was devastated that Babylon's downfall had come. These are crocodile tears, however. Inside, Isaiah's hearers were thrilled by the anticipation of Babylon's demise. Tyrants have always feared and hated the power of mockery, and by singing this song, Isaiah's hearers could exult ahead of time at the prospect of the destruction of Babylon and its king. Isaiah piles up images in his exaltation. First, he sees the Lord breaking the Babylonian scepter, with which the king had struck the peoples with unceasing blows. Verses 5 and 6. This results in a global celebration in song, delighting in the rest and quiet that has now descended upon the whole earth, now that the Babylonians have at last been silenced. Nature, too, will delight at the downfall of Babylon's king. The mighty trees that had been cut down for timber to feed the Babylonian war machine would enjoy a reprieve from the attentions of his lumberjacks. Verse 8. The underworld, too, is greedy to swallow the king of Babylon up, welcoming him into the shadowy state of weakness shared by all the rulers of previous mighty kingdoms. He, too, for all his vaunted power and majesty, will be laid unceremoniously in a tomb, to be eaten by maggots and worms. Verse 11. The king of Babylon made boasts about his divine status, claiming to be able to ascend to heaven, sitting with the gods of the Canaanites on the Mount of Assembly. Verse 13. He wanted to make himself like the Most High God. But the truth is that the Lord easily levels his pretensions and brings him low, like the day star. Verse 12. This is most likely a reference to the planet Venus, which seems to descend rapidly in the early morning sky. The Lord would make clear in the most graphic manner that the king of Babylon is a mere human being and not a god, as he dies and enters Sheol, like all the other rebellious humans. Older interpreters often saw in this passage a reference to Satan, or Lucifer, as the King James Version renders day star. The Hebrew literally means shining one. And the idea of this figure falling from heaven became linked with similar ideas in Luke 10:18 and Revelation 9:1. But in the context of Isaiah 14, it seems to be clear that there is a reference here to the king of Babylon. You can compare the similar description of the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28. It's certainly true that Satan stands in the shadows behind the leaders of this present world system, and their final downfall will be his also. As a result, the taunt aimed at the king of Babylon can, in a sense, also be leveled at Satan himself. Yet Isaiah's point is that the conflict between the Lord and Babylon is not a struggle between two equally matched gods, as in ancient Near Eastern mythology, but between the one true God and a mere human creature who will be brought down to the dust whenever the Lord so decides. Those who see the king of Babylon's final resting place will be amazed and will shudder over the terrible fate of the man who made the nations tremble, who seemed to have the whole world in his hands. Verse 16. In fact, the king of Babylon will fill the lowest place in Sheol, among those killed in battle and left unburied, rather than those who receive the more honorable fate of dying peacefully in their own beds. Verse 19. The one who left many homeless will now himself become a spiritual outcast in the world of the dead. His children will be cut off, leaving him without a lasting name. The Lord will rise up against the Babylonians and will cut them off from name and descendants, making their land empty and desolate. This is a reversal of the Abrahamic blessing in Genesis 12:1-3, in which God promises to Abraham land, posterity, and a great name. The oracle does not merely indict one Babylonian king, but rather the whole Babylonian system. The great city will be left abandoned and desolate as a home for the wild animals of the marshland upon which it sits. Verse 23. The Lord's purpose of destruction affects not only Babylon, but also Assyria, the nation that was more immediately threatening Judah in Isaiah's own time. The destruction of the Assyrian force in Judah, Isaiah 14:25, that took place in Hezekiah's time, which we read about in chapters 36-37, served as the immediate first fruits of the Lord's long-range promise to rescue his people from Babylon. The Syrians and the Babylonians might have their own plans and their own purposes in building their empires. But ultimately it was the Lord's purposes that would be decisive for the course of world history. Verses 24 to 26. No one and nothing could prevent his plans from working out in their own time. Verse 27. The chapter closes with a proclamation of judgment against Philistia in verses 28 to 32. The first of a sequence of oracles against Judah's immediate neighbors in the chapters that follow. For them, freedom from the Assyrian and Babylonian yoke would simply be the gateway to a new oppression. Even the remnants of their nation that survived the Assyrian assault would be killed by famine or by a new enemy coming from the north, the normal direction from which enemies approached during this time period. They would come with such a huge army that the cloud of their dust would be seen from afar, marching together with military precision, not a single soldier out of step. Verse 31. But we return at the end of the chapter to where we started, with words of reassurance for Zion and her people, if they trust in the Lord alone. With the death of Ahaz and the accession of his son Hezekiah, the same temptation re-emerged for Judah's leadership, to trust in foreign alliances. In this case, the one that was being proposed by Philistia, verse 32, rather than trusting in the Lord. But no, they're not to trust in the envoys from Philistia. Rather, the Lord who dwells in the midst of Mount Zion is their strength and their refuge. He is a very present help in time of trouble. Application questions. 1. Why is the future judgment of God's enemies good news for God's people? And how does that reality challenge and rebuke us? 2. How does the coming of Jesus change the singing of this Old Testament psalm? 3. Can we as Christians join this song? Shouldn't we love our enemies instead of taunting them with their inevitable downfall? 4. Will we sing this song forever? Or will there be a time when we will no longer sing this song?